In the next hour on Trial Story, a shot rings out in the subway.
Everyone hit the ground.
An off-duty cop steps in. He says he shot the armed man rushing straight at him.
I thought I was going to be shot and killed.
But plainclothes cop Desmond Robinson says that's not what happened. How did the bullets end up in Robinson's back? In the next hour on Trial Story, from opening statements to the verdict, friendly fire in the subway.
Summer in New York City. It's rush hour in the subway. Transit officers get a report. 2 teenagers in the station with guns. Suddenly, a shot rings out.
And basically, you could say all hell broke loose.
Plainclothes officer Desmond Robinson heads toward the sound.
Hearing that, I turned and I was worried about my partner. Drew my weapon and turned and sprinted as fast as I could.
Half a dozen transit officers converge on the scene. The passengers have panicked.
Everyone hit the ground.
We got on the floor. Everybody was under the, trying to get cover. Everybody was lying down on the platform.
Off-duty police officer Peter Del Debbio is on his way home, waiting to board a subway train. He draws his service revolver and steps into the subway car to protect the crowd.
As I entered the train, I started screaming, "I'm a cop, I'm a cop, I'm a cop."
He turns, his hand pointing out the subway door. Then a man rushes toward him with a gun.
I thought I was going to be shot and killed.
Del Debbio aims and fires 2 times. When the man fails to stop, he fires again, 3 more times.
First bullet. Felt like I got punched in the back.
Robinson is hit and he's down. Del Debbio has also been shot. Police officers swarm the scene.
I remember seeing like a semicircle of uniformed police officers with guns pointed at me, and as they pulled me out of the train.
Then the awful truth.
At that point, he told me, "I hope you realize you just shot my partner."
This is a case of friendly fire. Officer Robinson was in plain clothes looking for pickpockets in the rush hour crowd. He had done nothing to identify himself as a police officer, and Officer Del Debbio has mistaken him for a crook. This eyewitness also thought Robinson was a perpetrator, a criminal.
Sounded like there were 3 shots fired into the perpetrator's lower back.
His version of the story is disturbing. It appears that Desmond Robinson has been shot in the back. How can that be, if Del Debbio's version of events is correct? If he shot as Robinson rushed straight at him?
There was an individual running at me with a gun in his hand. I looked at that individual. Now he's continuing to move towards me. He's about 6 to 8 feet away from me. I decided I have to fire.
The story is all over the news.
What should have been a gun bust turned into a gun battle between officers.
It is being called a case of friendly fire.
It all started when officers tried to bust 2 gunmen.
At about 7:10, things got rather chaotic.
The city acts to thwart a potentially volatile racial incident.
All of us in the city are praying for Officer Robinson's recovery.
Police Commissioner William Bratton calls the shooting a tragedy.
My opinion today is we got 2 good cops that got caught up in an awful situation.
2 cops whose lives until this moment are remarkably parallel, except that one is white and one is black. Now Desmond Robinson lies unconscious in the hospital, and Peter Del Debbio must live with what he has done. Initially, police say Robinson took 2 hits in the chest or side, but the medical evidence is clear. All 4 shots entered Robinson's back. This doesn't look good for Officer Del Debbio or the NYPD. 2 days after the shooting, a court order to prevent destruction of evidence by police is requested by the Robinson family lawyer. The police and mayor sneer at the very idea of police misconduct.
There isn't the slightest suggestion that anything here is going to be hidden or concealed.
Miraculously, Robinson survives. 3 days after the shooting, he awakens and is said to forgive his fellow cop. The mayor and the press are there. The visit makes for banner headlines. Robinson's friend, Ray Garcia, tells a reporter about the meeting.
Said he was sorry, and he apologized for what had happened. And Desmond told him he was okay and not to worry, and it wasn't his fault.
The NYPD names a task force on risks to minority officers who work in plain clothes. Racial tensions seem to have been diffused. Until the next day, when some witnesses to the bedside meeting say Robinson never forgave Del Debbio, and Robinson himself says he was sedated at the time and doesn't even recall the mayor's visit.
I found out since, and I now know that I never said the words, "I forgive you."
Robinson says he had not run toward Del Debbio. He had sprinted past Del Debbio when he was shot in the back and could not have been seen as a threat. 1 month later, despite serious internal injuries, Robinson leaves the hospital.
How are you just generally feeling?
Awesome, just as long as I get out of here.
But those shots in the back continue to haunt the NYPD. The case goes to the grand jury, and after a month-long investigation, Del Debbio is indicted and charged with felony assault.
For his actions, he is being indicted, which is a terrible miscarriage of justice.
And Robinson sues the city and Del Debbio for $50 million. What really happened in those few chaotic moments in a New York subway? Who's telling the truth? Is this a case of white against black? A poor judgment involving the use of deadly force? Was it a terrible accident? Or did Peter Del Debbio shoot deliberately because he assumed a black man with a gun must be a criminal? In the next hour, a jury must decide whether the shooting was a tragic mistake but justified, or whether Del Debbio was reckless or worse, showed a depraved indifference to human life when he shot a fellow cop.
Without any further ado, Mr. Castello, opening statement.
Under ordinary circumstances, Raymond Castello and Peter Del Debbio would be on the same side of the law. But in this topsy-turvy case, Castello has the job every district attorney dreads. He must prosecute a cop.
And Officer Robinson was shot as he was falling to the ground and even while he was on the ground. Another police officer fired those 5 shots into the back of Officer Robinson.
Shooting anyone 5 times in the back while they're falling or on the ground, Castello says, is an abuse of deadly force.
And you'll hear that there was a discernible break in time between the first 1 or 2 shots and the other shots.
The break between shots is critical. Castello says the first 2 shots might have been a mistake, but because a pause between shots would have given Del Debbio time to think before firing again, the last 3 cannot be legally justified.
When he was given that gun, he was given it to act responsibly and reasonably. Maybe he panicked, but the evidence you'll hear is that he crossed the line of acceptable conduct.
The defense strategy in this case of cop against cop is to put Desmond Robinson on trial. Defense lawyer Richard Murray says Peter Del Debbio fired in self-defense.
He sees a person he's never seen before, a person who gives no clue whatsoever that he is a police officer. And he's coming directly towards Peter with the gun in his right hand.
Murray explains how a man who is moving forward could take 4 bullets in the back.
That initial graze wound caused Officer Robinson, who's coming forward, to start to pivot. And as he is pivoting, he is continuing forward. So what's happened is Robinson is now starting to turn.
There are important clues, Murray says, to Robinson's position when he was shot. And, he says, ballistics experts will undercut the prosecution theory that Robinson was on the ground when he was hit.
They examined the concrete for evidence of bullet impacts. They found none.
In response to a threat of deadly force, a shooting, even a mistaken shooting, may be justified.
Peter Del Debbio, on the day in question, did everything that he was required to do under police department regulations and everything that was consistent with his training. There is not one act, I suggest to you, that will be consistent with the people's theory that Officer Del Debbio acted recklessly. It's a tragedy, but it's not a crime.
The case begins with David Daigle, a subway passenger whose report of trouble, 2 teenagers with a gun, set off the chain of events that ended with the shooting.
As we were stepping off the 6 train, there was the normal jostling of the crowd, and the person in front of us getting off the train dropped a gun, which he bent over and picked up and very nonchalantly just walked away over towards the EF train.
Daigle headed for the escalators leading down to the E and F trains, where he told 2 transit officers what he had seen. Police ran to investigate. Then Daigle heard shots.
If I had to say, I would think it was a single shot, followed by a fraction of a second, and then 4 or 5 shots in rapid succession.
The single shot came from a shotgun the second teenager had tossed into the last car of a waiting subway train as transit officers closed in on him. The gun went off just a few feet from off-duty officer Peter Del Debbio, who was about to board the train. Dozens of people saw or heard what happened next. All agree that it took place within seconds, but their testimony differs about nearly every other detail.
I heard like 4 consecutive bangs. I heard a series of gunshots.
Do you remember how many?
6, maybe 7.
I would say could be anywhere between 2 and 5 in the first volley.
I didn't hear a break. From what I recall, I just heard a steady flow of shots.
After hours of testimony by eye and ear witnesses, it's clear that it won't be easy to unravel exactly what happened during those few chaotic moments. Perhaps the forensic evidence will be more conclusive. Detective William Rodriguez investigated the crime scene.
Do you see clothing in this picture which is connected with our case here?
Yes, we do.
Can you point that out for us?
Right here you see a black jacket and you see a white T-shirt.
Robinson's jacket and T-shirt were analyzed by police experts, but bullet holes do not reveal Robinson's position when he was hit or how close he was to Del Debbio.
I observed blood on the scene over here in this area and blood right here next to the door.
The blood next to the subway door is Robinson's, but it does not pinpoint his location during the shooting. And Rodriguez says he found no evidence that Robinson was on the ground when he was hit.
In the course of examining the platform outside of car 1042, did you find ballistic impact marks in the concrete?
No, I didn't.
Ballistic impact marks were found on a column and on the subway car. Detective Edward Wallace used those marks and the injury to Del Debbio's right arm to calculate probable bullet trajectories and, by implication, the likely positions of Del Debbio and Robinson.
And then I placed an officer of similar weight and height characteristics of Officer Del Debbio with a gun in his hand inside of the train and moved his arm around the trajectories to see how this type of injury could have occurred, what position his arm would have been in to sustain these injuries.
Wallace has concluded that a transit officer, Joseph Fitzgerald, actually fired the first shot, that one of his bullets struck Del Debbio's arm, then ricocheted to cause a graze wound to Robinson's chest. But he can't determine exactly where Robinson was standing when he was first hit.
Officer Robinson, at a maximum, could have been 15 feet away from what would be our left door jamb to as close as, I would say, approximately 3 feet from the door jamb.
After nearly a day of detailed but inconclusive scientific evidence, the prosecution calls a series of witnesses who say they saw some or all of what happened. Sari Linnehan, who does not appear on camera, peeked out from behind a pillar. Linnehan's testimony that she saw Del Debbio shoot while Robinson was on the ground is of crucial importance to the prosecution.
The man on the train, there was a small gun in his hands, and he fired. And I remember seeing his hand jerking, and I don't know how many, about 3 or 4, because once they come, it was very rapid fire, and to count them was 3 or 4, and I remember his hand jerking. I saw that.
What was the direction that his hand was pointing when you saw the hand jerking?
Towards the man on the platform.
And was that the hand that had a gun in it?
Yes.
And the man on the platform, what was he doing while this was happening?
He was lying face down on the platform.
But when Rich Murray cross-examines her about hearing the teenager's shotgun go off, Linnehan seems to have forgotten one fact about which no one else disagrees, clearly calling her memory into question.
Now, there was a train in the platform at the time that you heard the shot?
No.
There was no train? Okay.
Well, I don't really remember. I don't think there must have been.
Alice Green was in the subway car where Del Debbio stood when she heard a loud noise.
Now, the noise that you described, did you recognize the noise at that time?
Not at first. I didn't. Being a New Yorker, you know, that I did think the worst, that it was a gunshot. But having not heard gunshots before in my own right, I really wasn't that ready to subscribe to it being a gunshot. But I was still nosy enough to look out the window. Well, I turned in the direction that these people were falling to the floor of the car, and I saw an individual in the door of the train. It was open, and he had his arms extended, fully extended, and he was crouched, and his hands were aiming downward.
And did you hear anything at that time?
Yeah, I heard 3 distinct pops.
What were you doing while you heard that?
Trying to find my space on the floor.
Lieutenant Donald McCue says he saw what happened, but he got it at least partly wrong.
What I did observe at that point is that a muzzle flash, it appeared to me, seemed to be coming from the male black's firearm, and it seemed to be shooting in the direction of the male white.
McCue is clearly mistaken because the black man, Desmond Robinson, never fired his gun. On cross-examination, defense lawyer Marshall Trager brings out important testimony.
With your attention focused on those 2 men, at any point in time, after that male black went to the ground, did you see the male white stand over that male black and fire shots into his back?
No, I did not.
Officer Joseph Fitzgerald was chasing one of the teenage suspects and says he had nearly reached the last subway car when he heard a gunshot, then saw Desmond Robinson heading toward him.
What did you see Officer Robinson do at the time that you heard that shot?
He proceeded to fall towards the ground, towards the platform deck.
And what did you do at that time?
At that time, I heard another shot, and at that time, I shot my weapon.
But Fitzgerald's memory conflicts with the evidence developed by Detective Wallace, whose calculations show it was Fitzgerald himself who fired first. On cross-examination, Fitzgerald tells Rich Murray what he saw and did not see.
If there was any threat to your personal safety, it would have come from that subway door.
That's correct. That's correct.
So, is it fair or am I mistaken? You did not take your eyes off that doorway.
That's correct.
And you never saw Desmond Robinson shot while he was on the ground, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you never saw any individual step over him and fire shots into his back, isn't that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Officer David Thompson was Desmond Robinson's partner at the time of the shooting.
For how long had you been working with Officer Desmond Robinson?
4 to 5 years.
Thompson says he heard a shot, saw Robinson flinch, and took cover behind a pillar.
After you got to cover, did you look back in that direction?
Yes, just before I got to cover, I seen Del Debbio stick his hand out the car door and fire 2 to 3 times into Desmond's back.
Black officers, Hispanic officers, are inherently in more danger than their white counterparts in this city. That's the reality.
He who hesitates in our business is dead.
This is the first time a New York City cop has been indicted in a friendly fire incident, and members of New York's finest are here to support Peter Del Debbio, not shooting victim Desmond Robinson.
We did not take a position favoring one officer or the other. We took a position for the officer that was the aggrieved party.
Lou Matarazzo, who heads the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, the police union, says Del Debbio is the aggrieved party in this case because he did nothing wrong, while Robinson participated in the prosecution.
They have acted abominably. Abominably. He's the only police officer hurt, shot in the line of duty where the PBA didn't back him up.
After 5 days of testimony, Desmond Robinson takes the stand to tell his version of what happened. He says he was about 50 yards from the last subway car when he heard the teenager's shotgun go off.
I drew my weapon, shouted at the police officer to get out of the way, and proceeded, in order to get back to where my partner was, proceeded running down the platform.
Can you stand up and show the jurors how you had your weapon?
Like this.
Indicating directly in front, probably, what height is the weapon? A little above the belt?
A little above the belt, sir.
One of the 5 bullets fired by Del Debbio hit Robinson's waist pouch, but was it resting on his front or on his back?
Did you do anything as you were making the movement back on the platform regarding your pouch?
As soon as I started running, I had shifted it. I don't know where I shifted it to, but out of the way so it wouldn't bounce and hit me.
And you don't know which way you shifted it?
No, I did not.
Robinson says the panicked crowd had deserted the area where the gun fell, but as he jogged down the platform, he saw uniformed officers near the last subway car.
Once I got to about the last doorway, the last car, I saw my partner and several officers pointing their weapons behind the train.
When you say behind the train, can you point the vicinity that you mean?
Right around here.
Is that on the tracks?
It's on the track area, yes, sir.
And that would be on the diagram to the left of the train.
That's correct, sir.
Did you see at what they were pointing?
There was a male black wearing dark pants and a light shirt on the tracks with his hands up.
What did you do at that time?
Initially, I pointed my weapon in his direction. Seeing he was no threat, I lowered my weapon in front of me.
This testimony has Robinson facing sideways in relation to Del Debbio, not straight on. The prosecution says that's why Del Debbio could not have believed that Robinson was aiming at him.
Now, up to that point, in that vicinity of the doorway, did you identify yourself to anyone as a police officer?
No, sir.
Why not?
There was nobody to identify myself to. The people I saw were police officers that I knew.
Can you tell us what happened then as you were around that last doorway?
I had my weapon in front of me and I felt that I was shot. I heard a shot go off and I felt it in my back.
What did you do then?
I started to the ground.
And what happened as you were going to the ground?
As I was going down, I felt another shot in my back, a little lower than the first. Hitting the ground, my weapon came out of my hand and I laid down on the ground.
And what was the sequence of those first 2 shots?
There were pretty much 2 quick shots, and then I was on the ground, and there were more shots after that.
Once you were on the ground after those first 2 shots, what was the time period, if you recall, before the next shot?
There was a delay, not a long delay, but there was a delay where I thought everything was over and people in front of me could take care of whatever was going on, and then there were more shots.
For those last 2 shots, what were you doing?
I was laying down on the ground.
Then Castello asks about Robinson's bedside meeting with Del Debbio.
And do you remember the conversation that you had with him?
Not all of it, but yes, sir, I do.
You remember parts of it?
Yes, I do.
And what's the conversation that you remember with Officer Del Debbio?
Excuse my language, but initially something to the effect of shit happens.
That's something you said?
That's correct, sir.
What other conversation do you recall?
Don't worry about it. I'm still alive. We're alive. Another couple of seconds, who knows, I might have seen you and shot you.
Castello has Robinson put on the clothes he was wearing that night.
And can you give us the position that the weapon was in immediately before feeling the first shot?
It's about like this, sir.
So it's pointed up a little bit more?
That's correct, sir.
Thank you. You have a seat. And you can take those items off.
Gladly.
Then, another crucial piece to the puzzle.
Where were you in relationship to the doorway when you felt the first shot?
As I remember, maybe a little ahead of the door and to one side.
And when you say a little ahead, would that be, as you look at the diagram, to the left of the doorway?
That's correct, sir.
On cross-examination, Rich Murray stresses the mistakes made by Desmond Robinson, mistakes he claims make Del Debbio's actions totally justified. Robinson admits he ignored regulations that required him to identify himself. For example, by wearing a brightly colored band meant to alert other officers when plainclothes cops take police action.
You freely admit on this day you did not display the color of the day, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
You had your shield in your pocket at the time of this incident.
That's correct, sir.
Another way of identifying yourself that you talk in the by the police department is to simply verbally identify yourself. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And simply that could be nothing more than saying, I'm a police officer, or police, or I'm a cop, or something to that effect. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you, as you approached this car, did not do any of those things. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And in fact, the police department places the burden of identifying the undercover officer on the undercover officer. Isn't that a fact?
That's correct, sir.
And you'll concede that on this date, you failed to satisfy that burden. Is that correct?
No, sir.
It's correct to state you did not identify yourself in any manner during this incident. Is that correct?
I was never challenged to identify myself, sir.
The departmental regulations do not require that you only identify yourself upon challenge, do they?
I have to have someone to identify myself too, sir.
The prosecution ends its case with medical examiner Mark Flomenbaum.
The injuries are basically round. The defect is central and relatively small compared to what the exit wounds will look like. And much more importantly, the area of scab is quite thick, relatively thick.
Flomenbaum visited the hospital 3 weeks after the shooting to analyze Robinson's wounds.
Injury E, F, this will be G, H is where the bullet was removed, and I won't have I because it's still inside. But again, for the exit wounds, which I'm going to be calling E and F, on the next slide you see a close-up of E. We can see that it's quite different than those previous four.
2 of the 4 bullets that entered Robinson's back remained in his body. That means the existing wounds can't be used to determine precisely where he was when he was hit. Questioned by Rick Castello, Flomenbaum says what the prosecution wants the jury to hear.
Are they consistent with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty with Officer Robinson being on the ground when he was shot?
It is consistent with that, yes.
But his testimony on cross-examination also gives something to the defense.
Would it be fair to state that the shot pattern that's depicted in ABCD is consistent with these wounds being sustained as that body is in motion?
That's possible, yes.
It appears that, as the prosecution rests, even science is unable to provide definitive answers to the questions that haunt this case. So here's where we are in the trial. For 5 days, witnesses and forensic experts for the prosecution have tried to answer the pivotal questions in this case. Exactly where was Officer Desmond Robinson when he was shot by Officer Peter Del Debbio? Did Del Debbio reasonably fear for his life? Or did he abuse the right to carry a deadly weapon, firing 5 times at a man who posed no threat? The witnesses have disagreed about crucial details, and much of the scientific testimony appears inconclusive. But one thing is clear. Desmond Robinson was shot 4 times in the back. Del Debbio says he fired as Robinson charged straight at him and kept shooting when the first shots failed to stop him. Now the defense must give jurors a plausible explanation for those 4 bullet holes in Desmond Robinson's back.
Raise your right hand, place your left hand on the Bible, face the court clerk.
Del Debbio says he was on his way home from work, just about to enter the last car of the F train, when he heard a loud noise, then saw a shotgun lying in the open doorway.
When you saw the shotgun and you pulled the shield out, did you do anything else at that point in time?
Yes, in the time or distance between pulling out the shield and entering the subway car, I had drawn my off-duty weapon. I screamed in a loud voice, "I'm a cop, I'm a cop."
And to whom did you scream?
The panicked passengers that were inside the subway car running away.
Del Debbio says he bent down to pick up the shotgun, and as he began to stand up, noticed something in the middle of the subway platform.
I realize it's a individual, male black with a gun. From what I see, he's running straight at me. In my mind, I'm wondering who he is and what he's doing.
That man was Officer Desmond Robinson, in plain clothes.
Could you stand up and show the jurors this picture you have in your mind of this man as you first see him, how he held the gun in relation to you?
He's holding in his right hand.
Indicating for the record, your right hand held in the front of your body?
That is correct.
And the gun is pointed in which direction?
Directly at me.
Is there anything that you observe about this individual that led you to believe that he might be a police officer?
No, there was not.
Del Debbio says he looked for a police shield or color of the day, but saw none.
At this point now, I've thought that I've eliminated him in my mind as being a police officer, so now I must shoot him to prevent him from shooting me or anybody else.
And what did you do after you reached this conclusion that this man was going to shoot you?
I fired my weapon.
And where did you fire it?
I fired it at the individual.
And how many times did you fire your weapon?
Once, possibly twice.
And then what did you do?
I continued to look at him and realized that he was still coming at me.
And what, if anything, did you do when you realized he was still coming?
I thought I was going to be shot, so I turned away, kind of braced myself and continued and fired whatever remaining shots I had.
Tell us why you turned away.
Thought I was going to be shot, thought I was going to be killed, and turned away, moment of fear.
Del Debbio was then pulled from the subway car by an officer who had mistaken him for a perpetrator. He was handcuffed, but released when the officer understood he was a cop. Then Del Debbio demonstrates just how quickly he shot the 5 rounds.
Can you reenact as best you can what you remember what you did that day?
To the best of my recollection, I fired 2, I looked and fired the remainder.
You said you looked. Was this look a long pause, or just as you described here?
Just a fraction of a second.
Del Debbio says he had placed his police shield around his neck, but did not have time to identify himself verbally to the man running toward him before he fired. On cross-examination, Rick Castello tries to show that Del Debbio violated regulations intended to prevent just this type of incident.
And the onus of responsibility is on each officer to identify himself or herself. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir.
And you are supposed to make a verbal representation that you're a police officer. Isn't that true?
Only if the time permits you to do so. It is not a requirement.
The police department does not require that you make a verbal representation to somebody you see with a gun before shooting them.
No, it does not.
You're not supposed to say, police don't move.
If you have the time to say it, you can say it.
Well, how long does it take to say, police don't move?
Long enough for somebody to shoot and kill you.
Castello continues his attack.
When you were crouched in the subway car with a handgun in one hand and a shotgun in the other hand, and your shield out, and Officer Robinson did not fire at you, didn't that tell you something?
It told me in that situation, I was placed under deadly physical force. That's
Didn't
what
it tell you that either he was a police officer or he didn't see you?
It told me that he was possibly a criminal looking to kill me.
Okay, he was a criminal looking to kill you. Wouldn't you expect a criminal looking to kill you to fire a shot at you?
I wouldn't expect anything, sir.
When he didn't fire at you, didn't that surprise you?
No, sir.
You didn't expect him to fire at you?
I don't know what to expect, sir. I was looking down the barrel of a gun.
Anytime you take action in plainclothes, it's very important that you do things tactically correct. You have to send off all the proper signals. Anytime you take that gun out, you have to send out extra signals. Shield around your neck, radio out, color of the day, speaking a loud and clear voice. Police, don't move.
This film was produced by New York's Transit Police. It reminds officers to take precautions that Desmond Robinson didn't take, because they make it easy for criminals to identify plainclothes cops.
People doing the job every day have been doing what I did. Not to say I should be shot or anybody else should get shot because they weren't wearing a vest or because they didn't show the color of the day. Wrong.
Defense lawyer Rich Murray must give the jury a credible explanation for why, if Del Debbio fired as Robinson was running toward him, there are 4 bullet holes in Robinson's back. To do that, he calls Domiinck DiMaio, the retired chief medical examiner for New York City.
In other words, if the impact is here, you tend to turn because you're trying to sort of get away from the a complete force of the impact on the body.
DiMaio's theory is that the graze wound to Robinson's chest, the wound from Officer Fitzgerald's bullet, caused Robinson to spin around, so that bullets fired by Peter Del Debbio struck him in the back.
I think the first issue, Judge, is...
Then the defense suffers a series of defeats. Judge Bernard Freed rules that there is no reliable scientific basis for testimony by an additional defense expert.
All right, counsel, I have at this time decided to preclude Mr. Court from testifying as requested.
The proposed expert would have interpreted the sequence and rapidity of the shots to show that Robinson had pivoted around and was moving when he was hit. Freed also rules against testimony by a police psychologist about the physical reactions to great stress. After losing these battles, Rich Murray begins his closing argument.
Desmond Robinson made a lot of mistakes. Desmond Robinson, I suggest to you, was the cause of this tragic accident. But that's all it is. It's an accident. It's an accident based upon his failure to identify himself and Peter Del Debbio's reasonable assessment as to the threat that this man posed to him.
But it is Peter Del Debbio's and not Robinson's actions that must be explained. How did the bullets end up in Robinson's back?
Going from the left, the body rotates, boom, boom, boom. The bullet will come around in a manner consistent with what you see here.
Rick Castello says those shots in the back make Del Debbio guilty of first-degree assault, acting with depraved indifference to human life.
Well, what could be more depraved than shooting someone in the way it's been described to you? Going onto the ground, or on the ground, in the back, so many times. That's depraved.
Castello says Del Debbio was stuck with the story he told before the medical examiner made his report.
Every single shot was into the back. You can do pirouetting and you can do rotating and all of the other things that were done, but every one of these shots is in the back.
And there's no question, he says, that Del Debbio was reckless and caused serious injury with a deadly weapon, a second-degree assault.
The first thing to be aware of when you look at Officer Del Debbio's testimony is it is not true. Not that it's mistaken, it is not true, it's a lie.
That, says Castello, means the jury must understand what this case is not.
It's about time people realize that just because there's a black and a white on different sides, it doesn't have to do with race. This case just didn't have to do with race. What it had to do with was the conduct of a police officer whose use of force was excessive and whose use of force was unjustified.
The mayor's taken a side. Police commissioner's taken a side. I haven't heard from the mayor or the police commissioner since the time I saw them in the hospital.
Retired on disability, Desmond Robinson has lost the job he loved, while city officials rally to support the man who fired the gun. But whose side will the jury take? Judge Bernard Freed tells the 12 members of the jury to consider each of the 5 shots fired by Peter Del Debbio.
If at some point during the encounter, the defendant continued to use deadly physical force when he no longer reasonably believed that it was necessary to defend himself, then you must conclude that he was no longer acting in self-defense.
The jury retires to deliberate. Before them, the testimony of 29 witnesses. But the jury forewoman says they did not believe they could sort out the conflicting and confusing stories of eyewitnesses. Instead, they relied on science. The jury will base its decision on Ed Wallace's chart. Wallace's reconstruction of the crime scene explained Del Debbio's position relative to Robinson when Robinson was shot. Just 6 hours after deliberations began.
I have your note, ladies and gentlemen, which advises that you have reached a verdict.
As to count 1, assault in the first degree.
Not guilty.
Then as to count 2, assault in the second degree.
Guilty.
Peter Del Debbio has been found guilty of assault in the second degree, recklessly causing grave bodily injury, but not of showing a depraved indifference to human life.
I was devastated. I knew at that split second that my career would come to a stop, come to a halt. I think that bothered me actually more than the verdict.
As a convicted felon, Del Debbio can no longer serve as a New York City police officer. Now he must wait an agonizing 3 months to learn his sentence. On June 21st, dozens of police officers and members of the press jammed the courtroom.
Are we ready to proceed at this time?
The prosecution wants Del Debbio to spend time in jail.
It's the position of the people that a significant intermittent sentence is appropriate, and we recommend 4 months of weekends in connection with this case.
Then, despite his bitterness toward the police and the city, crime victim Desmond Robinson exercises his right to speak.
I know from my own experience that the loss of being able to serve the people of this city as an active member of the NYPD is a harsh punishment in itself. The imposition of jail time would serve no purpose here. So I respectfully urge the court to be merciful and lenient toward Peter Del Debbio. Thank you for your time, sir.
The judge has been influenced by Desmond Robinson.
If he can come before this court and state, as one police officer who has been recklessly shot by another police officer, that he believes jail time would not serve any purpose, I should listen to him long, and I should listen to him hard, and I have done so. Probation is the appropriate sentence. I believe, however, that you should be required to perform community service.
5 years probation and 200 hours of community service. Del Debbio has been spared the horror of jail, which can be particularly difficult for a former police officer.
But it is the most lenient sentence I could draw, so I am happy in a certain aspect.
I'm very confident that this conviction will be overturned.
In the meantime, Peter Del Debbio's future remains uncertain as he struggles to find something positive in what's happened to him.
Personally, I don't know if anything good can happen of it since it's completely destroyed my life.
Robinson's future is also uncertain.
If it wasn't just a job, it was a vocation for him. And that was taken away from him. He is both physically and psychologically unable now to shift gears into another way of life. I'm hoping that time, like everything else, will heal him, but it's going to be difficult.
With a $50 million civil lawsuit pending against New York and Peter Del Debbio, this incident is far from over.
Peter Del Debbio was a time bomb waiting to go off, and it went off on that night in August.
To say that in August of 1994 that there was something emotionally or psychologically or physically wrong with me that would lead to Officer Robinson becoming injured is absolutely ludicrous.
Robinson's civil lawsuit charges that Peter Del Debbio was unfit to work as a cop because of a traumatic incident that took place on a subway train 4 years before he shot Desmond Robinson.
They grabbed my girlfriend at the time and made her stand up. They made me stay seated. They ripped a gold chain that I had around my neck. They tore that off. They demanded my wallet. They took that. Took our cash, took cash from my girlfriend. Towards the end, they held out my right hand and said that I would not be a cop anymore, and with that, they attempted to cut off my right index finger and my trigger finger.
And Desmond Robinson has legal troubles of his own.
I am convinced that he acted in a very inappropriate but not illegal way.
Just a few weeks after the trial, Robinson was arrested for allegedly trying to rape the police officer who had counseled him after the shooting. He's not talking to the press, but his attorney, Brian O'Dwyer, says the incident was alcohol-related and that the stress of the past 2 years played a role.
One doesn't see your life end in a subway without having that come back to haunt you daily.
2 years after Peter Del Debbio and Desmond Robinson risked their lives to help others, one is a convicted felon. His victim faces serious charges, and the city of New York has lost 2 dedicated cops. I'm Rikki Klieman for TV.